We cannot teach a child who is experiencing trauma in the same way we teach a child who isn't. But how can we ensure, as teachers and parents and volunteers, that our children can access the education that we so desperately need them to have? My name's Angela, and I'm the founder of Katie's Readers, and I'd like to welcome you to our video series on trauma and its effects on learning. So welcome to our trauma series. I've invited 3 experts to help me address this question of what trauma is and how it affects the learning process. And perhaps even more importantly, what we as teachers and volunteers and parents can do to support our children through these trying times. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Kira Moseth, Dr. Tona Maguire, and Dr. Catherine Adams, who have very kindly offered their time to help us get this information out into the world. For more information about our guests today, please click on the link below and you will get lots of information about their qualifications, their expertise, their experience, and the amazing work they do in the world. So before I ask my first question, I'd just like to say that we met in Jordan over a lovely meal. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and talking about the work that you guys do and the work that Katie's Readers does, we really connected. And you invited me to attend your training with HST, your health support team. And I have to say that training really changed how we approach our work with Katie's Readers. It really gave us a better understanding of what teachers are dealing with in these circumstances. And it really helped us offer a better service to the people that we are working with. So thank you so much for inviting me to the training, and thank you for the work that you do. So Tona, would you like to tell us a little bit about HST?
Thank you, Angela. We're so happy to be able to share a little bit about what we did in Haiti and the development of HST. It began when Dr. Kira Moseth and I were deployed into a field clinic following the great earthquake just outside of Port-au-Prince. And we were very quickly overwhelmed with the tremendous amount of mental health needs that were coming through the clinic. So while they were presenting to a medical clinic, a lot of the complaints were actually related to the overwhelming stress that was associated with going through the earthquake and the aftermath of that. And so we were seeing a lot of stress-related somatic complaints, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, a lot of kind of acute stress sorts of symptoms. And we very quickly realized that we simply weren't going to be able to do work the way that we do it at home in our practices. And so our aim with HST was to develop a curriculum that could be taught to any ready volunteer within the community, anyone who's interested, the sort of people that the community tends to go to anyway. You know, the wise grandma down the street, the clergy member, the young university student who's a good helper in the neighborhood. And our process was to teach these people basic psychological concepts to help them understand what happens to people following any sort of disaster, both psychologically and otherwise, and then to begin to teach them the concepts that we would use in terms of intervening. Very simple ways of providing people with methods to calm their bodies and also to put a stop to some of the more negative thought processes that can happen when people are regularly and chronically stressed. And so our intent was that this would be culturally relevant, embedded in the community, not reliant on people from, for example, the United States flying in for a while and then leaving. And we've been very happy to find out that it's very translatable. We're teaching it here in the States. We taught it, as you know, in Jordan, and the circle is spreading wider and wider. So thank you for asking about that. We're very excited about the health support team.
Thank you, Tona. We're just happy to be able to help you get this information out there. So, Kira, what are the intentions behind the HST program?
Thanks so much for having us, Angela. I am just thrilled to be part of this project, and it's just great of you to include us and our work in this great endeavor that you're planning. I think it's a great thing, and we're thrilled to be part of it. In terms of the intention behind the HST program and how that got developed, the only thing that I would want to add is just the emphasis on how important it is to provide information and resources to people within the surviving community, and not have all of those resources be held from afar, but to give people that are actually in it and struggling with things on a daily basis the tools necessary for their own development and for their own recovery, so that they can assist themselves and other people in their community. It was really important for us right from the beginning that we focus on training people in the environment rather than having that information be held from an external source somehow. So I think this video series is very consistent with that, and I'm thrilled to be working on something like this again. Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you, Kira. I love how HST and Katie's readers seem to be so aligned in their intention to just share information and really get the information to where it needs to go. So really, thank you for helping us with that. Catherine, not only are you a part of HST, but you are also the director of an organization in Haiti called LIDE, which Katie's readers and LIDE are also really finding a beautiful relationship and working together on so many ideas. Would you like to share a little bit about what LIDE does?
Yes, thank you, Angela. Katie's Readers is connected to LIDE through its work in helping to train teachers who are also on our staff in teaching English to participants in our programs. LIDE is a program that does informal education for at-risk girls or girls who have been through traumatic incidents. We work mostly in Haiti right now, but we've also done training and consulting in the Middle East, in especially Jordan and Lebanon, where we train refugees to teach younger refugees. The refugees come from communities that are Palestinian, Iraqi, and Syrian. We also work with those within the country, so that wherever the programs happen, or wherever people are using our techniques to do programming for adolescent girls in their area, that the girls are seeing that everyone can come together and that we all have shared commonalities in life that help us get through these tough times. LIDE uses the arts in order to integrate a transition back to school and to help girls with some of the psychosocial issues that they are facing. And so it combines those two things in empowering them and making them feel more ready to go back to school. I first became connected with HST on Kira and Tona's second trip to Haiti shortly after the earthquake, when they realized that there were a lot of teachers who didn't know how to address the issues that were happening in the classroom. I had been doing some consulting around trauma in the classroom and how it affects learning. And so I was asked to join the team and to kind of focus on that area. Since then, we have collaborated on work in Jordan, working with refugees, working with people who work for NGOs, and are working with those who are in crisis or have fled from war-torn countries. And so our work continues with Katie's Readers, and we're really happy to be a part of this effort to reach out to people who can't come in for trainings, or where we can't reach them due to the remoteness or due to the situation that they're living through at this time.
I just love how HST and LIDE and Katie's Readers are all working with this idea of teaching people to teach people. LIDE is teaching refugees to teach refugees. HST is teaching volunteers to teach volunteers. And you know, at Katie's Readers, with our Pass It On program, we teach high school students to teach primary school students. And I just love that idea. It's a win-win-win-win for everybody. So let's get to the real questions. What is it that children or students need to enable them to learn efficiently?
Well, I think when we're talking about the education of children, one of the things we need to do is to think about kind of foundational issues. And those would be things like adequate rest, adequate sleep, adequate nutrition, some general sense of safety. We all have to have that kind of grounding in order to process new information, and that's certainly true for children. And then you run into the challenges when communities and people and families' lives are disrupted. And so the question is, how can you reestablish those foundational things to help the children learn under difficult circumstances? Say, for example, living in a temporary shelter, in a camp somewhere. And at that point, you begin to help the children by doing simple things like having a daily routine that they can count on, a sense of stability. We have our meals at the same time every day. We have a bedtime. We have playtime that's structured. And so there's some sense of building walls around the children to give them a feeling that there's a little part of their world that's within their control. So establishing those things, even under the worst possible circumstances. And then beyond that, I think in bigger terms, having family and community and certainly extended family value for education in and of itself, so that the child gets the sense from their parents, their grandparents, their aunties and uncles that education is important. It's a priority for the family, that there's a sense of true underpinning, a value for education in the child's life. I'm going to let Catherine talk a little bit more about specifics related to the classroom, but I think in terms of basic foundational needs for children just to be able to learn anything, those would be key.
There are so many things we can do, as you've just suggested, Tona, to create this ideal learning environment. And I know we will be talking in later videos and giving more examples of those things. I'd also like to talk about what goes on in the brain, or what needs to be going on in the brain for the efficient learning to take place. I realize as teachers, we don't really need to know all the details because the brain and its systems are very complex. But just generally speaking, what needs to be in place in the brain?
Yeah, the systems of the brain that are involved with learning and the trauma associated with learning are very, very complicated. It's certainly not just one thing, and that's what makes it difficult. I would emphasize that it sort of boils down to 3 different aspects of thinking that are particularly strongly affected when there's a traumatic event when it comes to learning. The first part would be attention, the second part would be memory, and the third part would be communication. So trauma affects all of those aspects of functioning in the brain, and they certainly take place in different areas physically in the brain. But for the purposes of, working with teachers and classroom experience, think about the steps that a student would need to go through to learn. They have to pay attention to the material that's being presented to them. They have to be able to store it and remember it somehow, and then they have to be able to communicate the results of those memories or to recall them at some point in the future. And trauma interferes with how every single piece of that process is conducted mentally and physiologically. So it interferes in terms of how those pieces of the brain communicate with each other, and then also how people's brains perceive the environment around them and what they're able to focus on and pay attention to, and then later recall. So attention, certainly memory in terms of what's stored, what's forgotten, and then communication in terms of how things can be recalled, and how even when you can recall something, maybe you're not able to articulate it in the same way that you would be if you hadn't been exposed to a trauma. So 3 sort of steps in the process that are all related.
Catherine, would you like to add something to that?
So Kara mentioned attention, memory, and communication as part of learning and important steps in the learning process. And Tona was talking about the effects of trauma on that process. I'd like to also kind of back up a little bit and just review quickly with the teachers a little bit about how the mind picks up information. So when kids learn in that attention moment and process, they could be giving attention to sounds or to sight or to movement. And the moment it comes into the brain, it actually, when they're first learning information, is going to multiple areas of the brain. It's moving all over, and it's looking for places where it can create a link, where the neurons go, this is a right fit. And this is happening neurologically in the mind. And so information comes in, and when they're first learning, it goes all over the brain. It's in the parts of the brain and the frontal lobe where logical reasoning is happening, and then it moves over and goes, I need to be more specific, and it might be in the temporal region where we are processing sound and words and thoughts that are verbal. Or it may go to the parietal region, which is in here, where we have kinesthetic information, where we process movement or how to move through space or the relationship between those two things. Or it might go to our visual centers, where we are imagining images or recognizing images. And all of that processing is happening in the outer cerebral cortex. And when we first learn something, it's all over the place. And so the interesting thing is, learning isn't about new places to go. Learning is actually about creating specific routes. And this is going to be important, this kind of what we call synaptic pruning. So you're actually getting more specific. You're getting more direct to going to the information. And when it comes to traumas, we'll be discussing later in this series, the next video, we'll be looking at how when emotions come into play and they interfere with that processing part of our brain, the information processing part of our brain, it causes that direct input and that finding the right spot to get lost. And those areas stop working. So when we teach, we often talk about trying to make learning visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and emotional, which is a fourth component that's been added recently because people have seen the value and importance of feeling safe, happy when you're learning. So by being in all those areas, you're actually helping information go to all the parts of the brain where it needs to be, rather than getting trapped in one specific area or pushed out. And that's going to be important in the recovery process as well. Something like reading requires multiple areas of the brain. At first, we used to think, it's only in one specific area, and that's kind of this language center here that's on the border of the temporal region where we pay attention to sounds and verbal messages, and the frontal lobe where we do logical reasoning. But really, they've realized it's in multiple parts of the brain. And so when kids get stumbling blocks, such as living through traumatic incidents, we want to reignite all the areas of the brain so that they can go back to learning again.
So what happens to learning when these systems aren't working efficiently, when the brain isn't working and developing the way it should?
What we've discovered over the last few years in some particularly relevant research is that bad events for children actually changes the way that their brain operates in big ways. And as I talk about this a little bit, it may make more sense in terms of the academic impact for them. So if you think about the brain kind of as a system, there's the part in the center that's kind of core for emotions and running the body systems, helping the heart remember to pound and the lungs to breathe. And then there's the overlay, the cortex, the kind of top part of the brain that has a lot to do with learning, planning, focus, attention. And when something difficult has happened to any of us, those pieces don't tend to communicate well with each other. And so that's what the research has been focused on, what are called adverse childhood events. And so when bad things happen to children, it has this sort of cascading impact on them. And so things like when a child is physically abused or beaten, or is neglected in some way, or has disruptions in their family, this creates a traumatic event for the brain itself. And so when that happens, the brain waves actually change. So the electrical currents in the brain don't function like they would if a child or an adult is in a situation where they haven't had something difficult happen to them. And so the statistics are concerning. So for example, in any group of children, you might have a quarter of them who have some abnormalities or anomalies in their brain waves. If the child has been abused, that doubles. So if the child is beaten or neglected, those changes are twice as much. If the child is sexually abused, it's 3 times as much. So the sexually abused child may 72%, as many as 72% of them may show some changes in their brain waves. If there's substantial neglect, the brain actually doesn't grow, and you can see in imaging of the brain that the size of the brain in an average child may be this big, and the size of the brain in a child who's been severely neglected and abused, undergone multiple traumas, is much, much smaller. It also creates trauma damage to key structures in the brain, as I was talking about, kind of the layers of the brain. So for example, there's imaging that demonstrates trauma to the hippocampus. That's an area kind of in the core of the brain that processes memories. And so you can see where the implications might come in terms of children being able to manage new information, trying to make new memories and keep that in appropriate ways. There's a little tiny structure in the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala activates when we're in danger. It basically says, watch out, watch out, watch out. This is not safe. And so in children that have experienced repetitive disruption, trauma, disaster, disruption in their families, losing their homes, whatever it is, witnessing violence, the amygdala tends to be overactivated. And so it is constantly giving out the signal that the child is in danger, in danger, in danger. So the children have a difficult time relaxing and calming, kind of like what we were talking about initially, so that they can process and understand and take in new information. And then the cortex doesn't function, and that's the key piece for education. That's the part of the brain, the upper level, if you will, of the brain that helps us to focus, pay attention to the things that are important and not pay attention to the things that are not important, to manage our time, judgment, what would be the smart thing to do in this situation. Any sort of educational planning, that's all cortical function. And so when a child is undergoing terrible disruption, all of that is impacted in many ways. And so even the brain chemistry is altered. So for example, serotonin drops out. Serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters in the brain that's so important for mood, and actually for lots of things. So when that drops low, that tends to lead to depression and anxiety and kind of an impulsive, irritable, aggressive sorts of behaviors. And when those things are happening in a classroom, not only is that child not learning, but if that child is acting out, all the children around him or her are not being able to learn effectively either. These effects may not be permanent, but they may take some extensive time for the child to recover. And so I think the other thing to keep in mind are the emotional aspects of what trauma does to a child in terms of their growth and development. And I think we may be covering that later.
Wow, thank you for explaining that so clearly, Tona, and helping us understand the effects that trauma has on a child's brain as it develops and the child's ability to learn. So, Catherine, can you tell us what is it we need to know about trauma itself?
The most important thing to understand about trauma is that it's not you. It's not the child. It's not the teacher. It's an event or an experience. So trauma are situations. They are moments in life where we lose the things that as human beings we are programmed to expect. Safety, a sense of control, a sense of purpose or hope for being able to live tomorrow. And when these things get swept out from underneath us, when we lose them, when they are shaken, that is what we talk about when we talk about trauma. So when you hear terms like PTSD, which means post-traumatic stress disorder, this is not a person. This is the reaction of their mind to a traumatic event. And their mind is actually having a fairly normal response. It is not normal for, as in the example of Haiti, hundreds of thousands of people to lose their lives in 2 minutes. That's not normal. It's not within our mind to grasp. So trauma often is defined as feeling as if your life is threatened or having your life actually be threatened. So it's important to remember it's both the belief and the actuality. It's also defined as believing that a loved one's life is threatened or having their life actually be threatened. So as we continue talking about this issue, it's important to keep in mind that our responses to trauma are our mind's normal adaptation to these abnormalities in the world. And they are abnormal. The other thing that's really important to understand about traumatic events and trauma is that there is a trauma cascade. So this is especially noticeable with people who are displaced. So whether you're internally displaced because of a natural disaster in your country, or you've been made a refugee because of war or crisis or drought or hunger, that creates a whole series of events that could be categorized as traumatic events. So you have, first of all, the issue that made you leave in the first place. Then you have the trauma of having everything that was familiar taken away from you. And then there is the additional trauma of feeling as if you're constantly under threat, whether that's because you don't want to be found while you're on the move, or because you have actual threats coming. Sometimes in natural disasters, they go from one natural disaster to the next because you might have something like an earthquake and then everybody's displaced and living in tents, and now you have a hurricane or cyclone on the way. So that is a traumatic issue. You have issues of people living in IDP camps, internally displaced person camps, or refugee camps, and thus the security in their everyday life is more limited. You can't lock a tent, and so you feel less safe. Women and girls are more threatened with things such as gender-based violence. Children face difficulties because they can't go to schools safely. They can't walk there safely. They don't even feel safe when they're in the classroom. So all of these things become like a cascade. If you picture tumbling rocks, one rock falls at the top, and then it makes the next pile of rocks fall, and the next pile of rocks fall. And this starts to feel like trauma in and of itself, this sense of, I can't stop this chain of events, this reaction of one bad thing leading to another and another and another. And this becomes a big part of what we then want to help kids deal with and cope with, and what we need to learn how to cope with ourselves or find ways to talk about and deal with, because many times we too are living in that cascade.
And if we don't learn how to deal with these tumbling rocks, with these events, what does that mean for the future of a child who has experienced trauma?
So if a child is undergoing chronic sort of traumatic events in particular, things like witnessing their mother being beaten, for example, or witnessing other kinds of violence, having the family be disrupted in some ways, the research seems to be pointing to kind of a trajectory for the child's whole life based on those kind of negative events that may have happened. And so in terms of kind of chronic trauma or major trauma, big, awful events in a child's life, it can lead to some significant disruptions. So, for example, the capacity to attach, to form emotional bonds with another person, to be able to understand and demonstrate empathy may be impacted by the events that have happened in a child. That has implications for having good relationships and being able to set appropriate personal boundaries, some important things. Those impacts can also include impacts on physical health. So, for example, just like when we were initially in Haiti and seeing a lot of complaints about stomach aches and headaches and feeling tight in the chest, feeling tired all the time, feeling dizzy, experiencing pain that doesn't seem to be related to medical conditions that can be sorted out. That can be as a result of a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events. And not only these sort of somatic stress-related complaints can come up, but there's an impact on the general health overall, so that the capacity to resist illness and to have less disease is lowered when you've had the kind of traumatic events that so many children have been undergoing. It has implications for coordination, like learning how to write appropriately, being able to move their bodies. It has implications for emotion regulation, so being able to not only understand emotions, but being able to manage them so that everything isn't an explosion of anger or an explosion of anxiety or an explosion of sadness all the time. Being able to kind of modulate that and manage those powerful feelings that everyone has. It has implications for consciousness. So when we talk about dissociation, that's a psychological term, it has to do with your sense of being present in the world around you. And when you have been traumatized, you may lose that capacity to a certain extent. And so the world may feel kind of unreal, or your own body can feel kind of unreal. You may feel like you're not present in some way, and that's a result of trauma. And then, and this is particularly important for the educational setting, the impact on cognition over time. So examples of, being able to focus, processing new information, planning and time management. I think I addressed that earlier, but all of those things are impacted. And as the adverse childhood events has studied people over time, they begin to see that not only are all the body systems impacted, physical, emotional, cognitive, but the actual lifespan of people is shortened when they are under sort of chronic, terrible adverse effects. And so all of that is part of a simplified way of pointing to the fact that when we're thinking about educating children who have been undergoing disruptions of this sort, we need to take into consideration that it's impacting all of them and be sorting out ways of helping them function in spite of that in the classroom.
It's so sad to think that so many children in the world today are experiencing traumatic events that really are not normal, and they don't know any better. We often, I hear teachers and parents and volunteers saying to their children, just be strong. So to get through these events, to the adults to manage these events, they're just telling the kids, be strong and don't cry and everything will be fine, and kind of brushing it off. But what can we do to support teachers to address these issues in the classroom appropriately without causing even more trauma on top of the trauma that the children have already experienced?
That's a really great question, Angela. And it's difficult because I think one of the things that prevents people from being able to heal and process trauma is fear around the idea about what might happen when they do start to talk about it, or when they facilitate, any kind of discussion around it, that it will get out of control. One of the metaphors that I use when I'm talking about this is the idea of a plug in a bathtub or something like that. You have a big amount of something and you're afraid that once you pull that plug out, it's just going to all come out and there's no controlling it at that point. Unfortunately, that's exactly what needs to happen. In order for real healing to be done, the plug has to be let out, meaning that the trauma has to be discussed, or there has to be some sort of facilitation around what the experience was like in those events that people have gone through, and children included. However, the way that that's done needs to be careful. So there's an out of control way to do it, and then there's a more in control way to do it. And I think oftentimes one of the misconceptions is that if it's going to happen at all, it's just going to be out of control. And I don't think that's accurate. I think it can be done carefully. And it should be done carefully. Avoiding something like this, avoiding talking about things, or of teachers avoiding helping their students process things like that, not only potentially hurts the students and doesn't help facilitate their healing, but also is not helpful for the teacher themselves. So the way to go about doing that is very intentionally, not necessarily spontaneously, but very intentionally allowing or facilitating a certain amount of time to talk about certain things, and staying focused on being in the present moment while that's happening. So one of the biggest risks is that once people start to discuss a trauma, or kids, or they're sharing something in the classroom potentially, that they get carried away and might start to relive it. And that's the point at which a teacher would want to do some kind of an intervention so that the student realizes that they are not currently reliving the trauma in the present moment, that they're actually in the classroom, that they're surrounded by people who care about them and want to know about their experience, but that it's not happening all over again. The teacher can use techniques to slow them down, to ask them to stop, take some deep breaths, draw their attention to things in the environment in the present moment that will help them refocus their attention away from sort of being wrapped up in the re-experiencing of the event that they might be discussing. But fear should not be the thing that holds people back from talking about this stuff, because true healing and really deep down healing requires that there is some level of processing to it rather than avoiding.
Well, exactly. And this is why we are creating this video series, because in all fairness, in defense of teachers are not psychologists, and they're not trained to handle these situations specifically. And so by talking about it, and by you guys offering information and ideas and tools, we are hopefully enabling the teachers to feel confident enough to handle these situations as they show up in their classrooms. So, Catherine, do you have something to add to Kira's point about the fear of addressing these issues?
Kara makes a really important point about fear and trying not to be afraid to address these issues in the classroom. You see them in the classroom, and you feel them yourselves. And so that's why we want to help you with some of the ways in which you can address this. You know, something teachers often say to me that they struggle with is they're afraid to do something because they're afraid they're going to do the wrong thing. And what we have seen in so many contexts, whether that's in school or out of school, at home with your own family, or on the street with a perfect stranger, the most valuable thing you can do is be there. And by that, what I mean is truly listening. If something comes up that upsets a child, speaking with them in that moment and turning it into a learning moment and a learning opportunity for the other kids in the classroom. Sometimes things will come up with kids in Lee Day, and it might be something very serious that we know all of a sudden tears start flowing from a young girl, and maybe she needs to go talk alone with somebody. And so a teacher will go talk to her alone. But that leaves the other kids feeling very fearful of that emotion. So we also talk about it with the kids, but in a way that gives them an opportunity to share their own thoughts and also to reassure them that they are safe and that this is an emotion. And where they are is in the classroom, and where they are is safe, as Kira was saying, reminding them of what's happening right now. And so listening as a teacher becomes, in these times, as valuable as being capable of communicating ideas and helping kids learn by being a good communicator. Communicating is listening, and you're going to be learning to listen to the body language of kids and not just their words, and learning to listen to the other ways in which they communicate. They communicate through their behaviors, they communicate through their play, they communicate in what they write about, what they draw. And so these become ways that you can communicate with them. And we're not saying that you're going to look at a drawing and suddenly go, oh, what this means is, because we don't know what that means. What it is it opens an opportunity to sit with a child and say, what do you think it means? Sometimes also teachers get afraid because when kids start talking about things that are sad in their own lives, it brings up sadness for themselves. And they're afraid that they're going to cry, and they're going to feel this sadness. That's okay. We don't want you to lose control over your emotions. But if you start to tear up a little bit, it's okay to say to a child, you know, what you're going through is very sad. And so I feel tears in me right now too, because it's sad. And I understand that. And you have a right to be sad. It's okay. And then helping them move from there to hope. Helping them move from that sorrow to something that's going to give them something steady to hold on to. And we'll be talking about that when we talk about ways to help kids with grief and ways to help them with controlling their own behaviors again. And so these become important steps in what's truly important in being strong. You know, I had a student once say to me, Professor Adams, you're so courageous. You like go into these war zones or wherever, and you're not afraid. And I went, oh, you're so wrong. I get afraid. I do it anyway because it's important. And so it's important for them to learn that courage is not about not being afraid. Courage is about realizing you're afraid and doing something anyway, but with wisdom. With understanding of the risks and with reducing those risks. And so in a way, when we begin to teach this to kids, we help give them control over their lives. And it's important for kids to feel a little bit of control over their out of control world during these difficult times.
Yes, and we need to remember that each child will have a very different way to express that out of controlness in these situations. We're all different and we all handle things in very different ways. So what is it that makes one person be able to handle a traumatic experience and another person fall apart and be totally overwhelmed by an experience like that?
Absolutely, that's true. Every single person handles a traumatic event in a very, very different way. And you could have the exact same thing happen to, a group of 10 people, and every single one of them would respond emotionally, physically, and mentally in a slightly different way. I think one of the important takeaways here is to recognize that there's not really a wrong way to do it. Everybody does have their own processes and should be allowed their own sort of time frame to process whatever has happened to them. But what we can do sort of as educators is to facilitate the healing that people go through on whatever time frame and in whatever capacity that's going to happen for them. People tend to respond, if they're going to respond negatively, they tend to respond in sort of one of two ways, either by acting out a great deal, especially with students and kids is what we're talking about now. Risky behaviors, violent or aggressive behaviors, doing things that they know they shouldn't do, getting in trouble, being mean to other kids. That's on one end of the spectrum. And then on the other side is the kids who withdraw and isolate and sort of shut down without talking to friends, and they just sort of pull into themselves. Both of those ends of the spectrum eventually can result in someone who is resilient and heals just fine. And it's actually very normal to see both of those things. So if that's something that's familiar to teachers and that they're seeing that in the classroom, that's a very normal reaction to a series of abnormal events. It's also important to note that most people experience some pretty strong reactions to big trauma. And they can be physical, they can be emotional, they can be cognitive, they can be any of those or all of them. And that's a very normal thing. Most people do. And the irony is that most people think that they're the only ones that are experiencing those things. So they think there's something wrong with them, or they think they're going crazy, when in fact, most people around them are in the same boat. But they don't realize that that's the case because nobody's talking about it. So in order to sort of normalize what's going on, everybody needs to be made aware of, listen, these are normal reactions. To have trouble remembering, to have trouble thinking about things, to have trouble being emotionally appropriate, or having sensitive communications with someone without breaking down. That's all normal. That's all part of the thing. For school children to have trouble focusing on things, to regress back to suddenly act like they're younger than they are, that's normal too. The big picture suggests, in terms of tons of research, however, that the ultimate ending and the sort of ultimate end of the road here for the recovery process is generally resilience for people, which means that both children and adults, when they can focus on finding purpose in their life, finding connection and establishing new connections with other people and other situations, and accepting the fact that these traumatic events have changed things in their lives, those people are going to do fine. They're going to move on and they're going to be okay. And most people are those people. So the elements of resilience, including purpose, connection, and acceptance of change, and also hope, are really telling, very important and essential for the recovery process.
And Catherine, I know you talk a lot about resiliency in your trainings. Could you explain to us what resiliency is?
So resiliency as a concept has three key areas that we really try and address. The first is connection. The next is flexibility, adaptability. And in education, we call this having a flexible mindset. And the third is a sense of hope, which can come from purpose. And so connection, when we speak of connection, this connection could be to one single other person. It could be to a faith or a belief. It could be to a community. It could be to an animal even. I've seen it even with people and their pets. but that sense that there's something out there in this world that recognizes I am real and that I have emotions and that cares about me, and our equal recognition of another person and our care and concern for that other person. And with flexibility, it is the ability to adjust to the changes that are happening all around you in a time of trauma. And those adjustments need to happen in our minds before they can happen in our behaviors. Or we can make them happen in our behaviors, which will also change our minds. But the mind is an important part of that, whether it starts from behavior or starts from the mind. And then hope. Hope and purpose are what make us want to get up the next day and keep going, even when everything is feeling like it's lost.
It seems resiliency is something that we should keep talking about, because it seems really key in helping our students move forward. But what, as teachers in the classroom, can we do now? What can we do?
I think for teachers, that's a really tricky thing to try and figure out how to do. Like, what do you actually do in the classroom to help kids move forward after they've experienced something very difficult and shocking? The first thing I would recommend is to build in some sort of way in the classroom day, in your time frame, in your schedule, to facilitate addressing this specifically. If it goes undiscussed, if it goes ignored, that's the kind of thing that can really have an impact throughout all of the activities that kids do, because it's sort of behind the scenes, but nobody's really talking about it. So the first thing I would suggest is to be flexible and to include some sort of way to address this overtly, either individually with kids or as a group, and not have it just sort of simmer behind the scenes. Another thing in terms of a specific recommendation would be to have teachers be very flexible in the classroom. It means having to adjust teaching styles. It means having to explain things in different ways, using different techniques, using more active techniques, using techniques that allow multiple different parts of the brain and mental processes to be active in the learning process, because what that ends up doing is facilitating for kids who are stuck in a particular way of being. Either they're stuck emotionally, they're stuck with their memory, or they're stuck with concentration, something, the trauma is messing up something there. When teachers are flexible in the way that they present materials, then that really helps all of the different aspects of the brain pick up and tune into whatever thing that they are able to respond to at that moment. So one of the worst things I think teachers can do is sort of stick to the same old way that things were taught before the traumatic event and just do it because you know how to do it that way. It's really important to be adaptive and to be flexible after the event has occurred. Catherine can speak much more about this, but those are just some ideas that I have.
Yes, Kara, we do need to make changes to the way we teach in these kind of situations. And if you think about it logically, the world around you has changed. You can create stability and you can create routines, just as Tona was recommending. Routines are so important for feeling stable again. But they do need to be slightly different. Imagine after a traumatic incident, whether it's natural disaster or conflict, even your route to school can sometimes change, and we have to adjust. And it doesn't mean we stop going. It doesn't mean we keep walking on that path, but we have to find a different way of getting there. Same thing's going to happen in the classroom. And what you might realize is it actually opens you up to finding deeper ways of helping kids learn, and helping kids learn at a deeper and more effective level over time. So some of the things that we'll have some opportunities to go into more detail about later on in some of the other videos are changing teaching by doing things like chunking down material and instructions. So never giving too much all at once. Remember, our brains have been overwhelmed. That thinking part of our mind has now been overpowered by the emotional part of the mind. And it needs to be reactivated, and it needs to come back into focus. And until it comes back into focus, kids can only handle a few directions at a time. And it kind of depends on their age. So for primary school kids who are in their first through third year levels, they may only be able to handle one instruction at a time. Open your book. Once everybody opens their book, write your name. Everybody writes their name. So that's slow, and we call that chunking down material. The other thing that you can do is using teaching methods that activate not just visual and auditory centers, but also the kinesthetic. During fight or flight mode, when we're in a panic, the amygdala, which we talked about before, Tona talked about it, takes over, and it has a little bit of power over those physical parts of our body that either want to freeze and hide or run away. So we can take advantage of that as teachers, and we can do active learning that involves the body, which goes to a part of the mind that's still alert and paying attention. And then if we add to that auditory and visual and emotional opportunities to connect with the learning, then that helps almost like reawaken concentration and bring us back to there. The other thing that becomes important is changing the activity that you're doing in order to teach an idea or concept or subject every 20 to 40 minutes. And I say 20 to 40 because it depends again on the age, and it depends on your students. You want to learn to read the attention level of your students. And changing activities doesn't mean you change the topic. Indeed, they need you to stay on the same topic so that there is some focus and there's building of the brain towards focus. But what it means is you stay within their capacity to pay attention. Trauma causes the mind to become hypervigilant and to pay attention to everything that's going on around them with acuity, because you feel as if you're under threat. And the mind believes it's under threat. And so it's hard for the mind to focus for a long period of time. Therefore, what we do is, if you're working on a grammar topic, you still work on that same grammar topic, but you change the activity. You go from doing something where they're writing and reading to doing something where they're playing a game, throwing a ball, but still working on the same topic. And so that slight change wakes them up and wakes up their minds and brings them back into the classroom. The other thing you can do is integrate expressive outlets into daily activities as part of the class. It could be giving them a few minutes to journal about their morning or their day or their feelings, giving them a drawing activity. And in that drawing activity, maybe they're focusing on something that gives them hope. Doing theater games. Theater games are actually really wonderful for bringing that kinesthetic aspect of learning into the classroom. And you can use theater games to actually teach cognitive concepts or classroom concepts. And we can talk more about that individually and independently in future videos and in our Q&As.
This is a really big subject, and we can't possibly fit everything that we want to share with you into one video. What we have discussed today is how we learn, what is required from the environment and from the systems of the brain to enable efficient learning, what is trauma, and how trauma interrupts that learning process, what resiliency is and how resiliency is key to the healing process. And we've given you some ideas on how you can get started in your classroom to address these issues among your students. We really hope this video has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, or you would like to share your experiences with us, please contact us through our Facebook page, our website, or even comment below this video. We really love to hear from you. In our next video, we will talk about how to identify trauma among your students and yourself and your colleagues, and perhaps most importantly, when you need to call in a professional. We will also talk about the importance of self-care. So thank you so much for watching. I would like to thank my guests, Dr. Kira Morseth, Dr. Tona Maguire, and Dr. Catherine Adams, who will join me in this entire video series. My name is Angela, and I'm the founder of Katie's Readers.